The beginning of Daf, Succah Daf Yomi begins 7 lines down from the top of the Yomim. The Gemara continues the discussion of the previous Daf regarding the interesting case of the mission of Succah, when you go and you take the whole courtyard and you make kosher schach with the walls of the porch that are in the perimeter of the houses, regarding that case, and when are we going to say when there are certain halachas that will permit it and when not. Everyone is joining us for today's Daf. So we're discussing today's Daf are, as we mentioned, regarding this case, a sukkah made across a courtyard, as this picture illustrates, the status of a round hut as a sukkah or using a lean-to as a sukkah. So it's an interesting shape where the walls and the roof are really like continuous. The halacha regarding using reed mats as schach that extends past a sukkah. And some of the important terms and concepts today is about 40 sa, which is the minimum measurement for a kosher mikvah. Some chalakaisla is that you take the schach and you lean it against the wall. So we had said in the previous daf that if someone makes schach on an achsadra, which have petzimin, which have these poles. So the first version we had said, everyone agreed that it's going to be kosher, because you'll say love it. However, if there's no petzimin, we said, the machlek is Abai and Rava. Rava says to be possible. You don't say particular decisive because you don't say it all. At least you don't say it all the sides. Abai says kosher. You say particular decisive because, like we said, the thickness of that tikra is really a vertical wall. Now, we had asked, however, on Abai, we said, wait a second. Our Mishnah said clearly not like Abai. It said if you have a chatz that's surrounded with a chsadra, if you have beneath a dalam, it's going to be possible, and it doesn't utilize particular decisive. Why not? According to Abai, you should take pitikra. It says even more dalam. You don't need daf in the kumah. You don't need anything. You don't need petzimin. You have pitikra. So the Gemara answered, no, kishish bez kiruye. You're talking about you don't have pitikra because you made the schach exactly parallel to the board, and that was how we explained it. Now that's how Gemara continues. In Surah Masnaloshmaita, in Surah, it's the name of a place. That's how they taught the machlekes Abai and Rava from the previous daf, Bahai Lishna, in the way we just described it right now. But Pumbedisa Masni and Pumbedisa, that they taught it actually the opposite. That is as follows. If let's say you make the schach on top of the porch, not on the porch, but meaning that it's leaning on the top of the chsadra, but it's actually between the chsadrais. And if it doesn't have that poles, actually divrei kol psula. This version holds that everyone holds is going to be possible. Not like the first version Abai says it's kosher. Why? So as Rashi explains, because since the tikra, since this roof of the porches, were made only for the airspace of the porches. It wasn't made for this airspace beyond it, where we're suddenly becoming like Yidden are very, inventive. They're able to make a sukkah now in the middle. So you can't say that the opening, the thickness of that board is like suddenly walls for the airspace beyond it. So everyone would agree in this version, you're not going to say pitikra. It's going to be possible. Now, yesh labsimin, but if there are these poles, and it's less than 3 tvachim one from the other, that's where the machlekes was. So it's the inverse of the first version. The first version had everyone would hold it's going to be kosher by petzimin. Machlekes was when there's no petzimin. This version says no. When there's no petzimin, everything's going to be possible. When there are petzimin, it's actually machlekes. So Abayam kosher is kosher, but Rabbi it says it's going to be possible. So what's the understanding? The more explains. Abayam kosher says it's going to be kosher because I'm reading love it. We say that even though that these petzimin, these poles, were really meant to hold up, let's say, the achsadra, and not for the ear beyond it, but it's still ultimately a wall, because anything that's less than 3 tvachim is like, it's like closed. So, I don't care what it's made for. A wall is a wall, avant is avant. So, yeah, this sukkah that's made in the middle of the courtyard, it's surrounded with walls on all 3 sides. Rabbi Amtsula, no, in this version, Rabbi says it's going to be possible even if it's petzimin. Why? Well, I mean, love it, we don't say love it, as Rashi explains. Love it is not like you think. It's not a wall. It's Allah Meshina. When did we say Allah Meshina is going to treat it as a wall? It's only for the airspace that it's made for. But to use it for the other side, for that, we're not going to consider it as a wall. And therefore, even if it's less than 3 tvachim between these petzimin, in this version, Rabbi says it's going to be possible. I think Mar concludes. Halacha is like the first version of Rava, not like the second version. So what does that mean? So as Rashi explains, we will say loved with the petzimin, like the first version said, even for the airspace beyond it, meaning for the schach that's in the middle of the courtyard. But to say pitikra, that we won't say because that's only for the airspace that it's meant for, but not for the airspace beyond it. So again, it's like Rav in the first version. Now the Gemara brings a story related to this, that Rav Ashi, Ashkechel Rav Kanda, Rav Ashi and Rav Kanda, to come agabe chasadra, he was making schach, like this case that we're describing on chasadra, but she'ein lebetzimin. It didn't have these poles. Now, this sukkah had two halachic walls, one in the south and one in the east. The third one he made near an achsadra, but you couldn't see that the tefach, which really would help had we had a picture. I don't have a picture of this, but they didn't have the third wall as a tefach like the Chacham said, and it didn't have petzimin. Somebody says, says, wait a second, there's no petzimin. So let's say go to this picture. This picture was like how we would think this was. It actually wasn't. But if let's say you have this, so it didn't have petzimin, so how are you making schach if there's no petzimin? Rabbi doesn't hold a pitik or yard precisely in this case. So how's it kasha? So says the Gemara like this. Achvile, he showed him that there actually was patzim that had a tefach and more that was near the open area, but it was drawn, its thickness behind the sukkah in the length of the porch that was more than the area of the sukkah. So you couldn't see it in the sukkah itself, rather it was equal to the wall at the end, which was, as the Gemara explains, what's called nira mibifnim. You could see it from the inside, but v'shaveh mibachutz. When you're looking from the outside, it actually looks the same from the achsadra. So therefore, he couldn't see that there was actually a third wall of a tefach, but actually did have. Or inami, and the reason why I'm going to inami, because you'll see the Gemara's picture is actually the inami's picture, the other way around. What's called nir mebachutz. Lets you see it from the outside, but v'shaveh mebifnim, but you don't see it on the inside when you're in the sukkah. So those who are standing inside, they don't see that patzim, that board. But if you're standing in achsadra, which this picture could illustrate that, right? There's people in the sukkah inside, and then you have the porches, which are not part of the sukkah. That's the vibe sit over here on the outside or whatever. But if you're standing at achsadra, opposite the sukkah, and you don't see the airspace, you could see the board that's like the beginning of a third wall, as the picture in the Gemara is having. You see the picture in the Gemara, you have two walls the sukkah had. And there was nachsadra throughout, all around. Now, regarding the fact that that achsadra that was there on the side, you didn't have petzimin. So he was wondering, if there's no petzimin, so how are you going to say it's kasher? You only have two walls. So he says, no, you don't understand. Forget about the achsadra. If you see the picture, it's sticking out, what's called nir mibachutz. You see the third wall from the outside. You don't see it from the inside. So that would, however, qualify as a third wall. And therefore, it's going to be kasher. Because that's what we learned regarding the halachas of mavli, which you validate with a lechi. If you put by the end of the entryway, which is it's equal to lechi. Lechi is a side post. If you put it equal to the end, so it ends with the thickness of a lechi and along the length of the wall on the inside, where you see the end of the wall, it doesn't stick out anything more into the opening of the Pesach. But near bebachutz, let's say you see it from the outside, it sticks out if you were coming from Rosh Hashanah, either from the front or from the side, you could tell when you're standing on the outside, it's not an extension of the wall, this lechi. But when you're inside, you don't see it any different, as it just looks like it's an extension of the wall. Neither mishum lechi. It would qualify as a side post. So here also, with this patzim, this board that is an extension of the achsadra, it would qualify as a wall. So that's again, that goes back to the picture, and that's what the Gemara says, Hainu Petzimin. That was the patzim over here in this case. The reason why it was kosher, you're right, it doesn't have Petzimin, but it has this one board that's near Mibachutz and Shav Mevnim, or it could have been just the other way around. It depends on where they were standing. Could have been near Mibachutz, B'Shav Mibachutz. But the case that we're discussing that our Gemara has a picture of is near that you don't see it on the inside, but you see it on the outside. That's a third wall. That's going to be valid as a tafach, even though again it looks like it's only on the outside, not the inside. That still qualifies as a wall, as we see by the laws of lechi, of mavoi, and it qualifies as a wall. And therefore, it's going to be kosher. But you're right. He held like Rav that it would be possible without betzimin. You're not going to be able to use the p tikra of the chsadra. That's why this picture is not so perfect, the way it's drawn, this two-dimensional picture, but it's really validated for a totally different reason, simply because of nir b'vachos b'shavim b'vifnim. Now, also continue on these halachas of tzrach, Tanu Lina Braisa. Psal hayitzim nasukkah. Psal again is a terminology for kosher tzrach. It's coming out of the sukkah, nidin kesukah. It's going to be qualified as a sukkah. So the Gemara doesn't know what does this mean. My psal hayitzim nasukkah. What does it mean tzrach coming out of the sukkah that's going to be kosher? So the Gemara actually brings 4 explanations for this Braisa. Interpretation number 1. He says, Kanim, if you have reeds, meaning from the schach, hayitzim la'achayri sukkah, that is sticking out behind the sukkah, behind the middle wall, which is behind the sukkah, that's going to be kosher as a sukkah. He says, well, how could you say that? But being in Shalosh Ram, you need 3 walls. You only have the back wall. He says, well, no, but they can know. You actually have 3 walls. The walls actually, not only the back wall extends, meaning it's not only going, you only have the back wall, the side walls also extend. He says, but you need to have a shiur of 7 tvachim, because obviously you're treating this as its own independent sukkah, because it's separated by the back wall, so you need to have a 7 tvachim. He says, but you do have that. He says, okay, but you need to have more shade than sun. So he says, you do have that. Says, I remember, what's the chiddush? This is 2 sukkahs. It's like a townhouse. We all live like this, right? So you have to, so the 2 neighbors are sharing the middle wall. Says, no, since this wall was meant for the inside, it wasn't meant this middle wall for the outside. Same alloy, I would say that since it's not meant for that, and also the side wall, since initially was made for the middle wall, it's just that you put like a wall in middle, and when you saw that was sufficient. So, but it's not meant for the area beyond it. So I would say that you can't do this as a sukkah because it was made only for the area inside of it. Mashmalan, that's what we're telling you that no, that it's going to be valid even when it comes beyond. That's one interpretation. They both say a different interpretation. Here we're talking about that the schach is actually continuing by the 4th open wall of the sukkah, where it continues going out beyond the length of the side walls. But there is one wall from the side walls that does continue bahadai with the kosher schach. Now, as this picture illustrates, it says, where would you say that since you're not continuing with the second wall with it, so obviously that is considered something independent. So you don't have 7 tvachim for hechsher sukkah. So you would say that this psal hayitzim sukkah would not be kosher. This is halacha, we off quote this halacha, this interpretation. It's not considered part of the sukkah, and like Rashi makes a comparison, he says like the halacha when you have 2 walls and the third zone is even a tafach. So it's not continuing till the 4th open wall, and still you say it's kosher. So here also the psal hayitzim sukkah is going to be the same way, and it's going to be kosher in this. Third interpretation, Rabbi he says, we're talking about a certain sukkah. Sheruba, this is the way you have to read it with a comma. Sheruba, that the majority of the schach is salasim chamasim, is valid, meaning it has more shade than sun. But a miyuta, as this picture illustrates, but some of the sukkah is chamasim and salasa, has more sun than shade. So Mavdim, would you say Tipasavach pointed that the sukkah would be invalidated that little, which is invalid because it's chamasim and salasa? Mashmalan, we're saying that no, that it's going to be kosher. And as the Gemara explains, the words of the Brisa were psal hayotzim in the sukkah. Where do you see that interpretation in these words of psal hayotzim in the sukkah? It means yotzim hechsher sukkah. It means to say that it's not covered with schach according to the validation of the halachas of sukkah. So it's psal, it's kosher schach hayotzim in the sukkah that comes out of the category of hechsher sukkah. That even so, it's going to be kosher because the majority of the schach is tzilas b'ru b'chamasim. 4th interpretation, Rabbi Shloimy says, "L'nitzcha ella l'schach pasal pachas mishleishin." This halacha is actually teaching a halacha that we know very well. If you have schach pasal less than 3 tvachim, the sukkah ketana by a small sukkah, what's called the beer minimum sukkah size, what's called mitzumtzum, exactly 7 by 7. So what does it mean? It's psal, it's kosher schach hayitz in the sukkah. It means yitzim in Torah sukkah. means to say that it doesn't even have kosher schach. What we're saying is, still, the psal hayotze min ha-sukkah, even though it doesn't have the Torah's sukkah, this psal, it's not even a kosher species, still, it's going to be kosher. Because it's less than the shiur of the psul, which is the, meaning, we know post-pasal schach is a problem with four tvachim. But here, since it's less than 3 tvachim, so we're going to say, like the halacha of Lavid, and therefore, that invalid schach, which departs from the laws of sukkah, is not going to invalidate the shiur of the sukkah. Now, Master Rabbi Shloimy asks, says, what do you mean? Lehele aver. It should only be, it shouldn't be any, it should only be ear. Now, it's obvious that it's going to be kosher, because ba'aver, ear space, which is more severe, when you have less than 3 tvachim by a small sukkah, you possibly think it invalidates. It doesn't invalidate that shit because you're going to say love it. So what's the chiddush of your halacha? What's the necessity of this psal yitzim and sukkah that you have less than 3 tvachim by pasal schach? It's not going to be a problem. What do you mean? Of course not. Even avid is more chamer, less than 3 tvachim is not a problem. That Rabbi says, you're right. I would know it from a kabbalah from aver. But the reason why I needed to say that the psal yitzim and sukkah is nidun kesukah, is going to have halacha like sukkah, because we have to tell you actually an added chiddush. The added chiddush is that zeh by schach pasal mitzvah fishin tafel. Not only does it combine for the shiur of zayin hazayin, but you could even sleep beneath the schach pasal because of bittul to the schach. But the zeh, regarding when you have airspace less than 3 tvachim, you're right, mitzvah. It's going to supplement for the shiur of the sukkah to make it that as if you're covered with schach of zayin tvach. But you can't sleep beneath it because you're not underneath the roof. You're underneath the airspace. That's why we want to tell you specifically according to this interpretation that you can even sleep beneath the pasal schach. Says the Gemara, is that really so? The way you explain the airspace, that you have something that's going to be combined for the shiur, but what's made a kosher, but in itself underneath that area is not going to be kosher. How's that possible? Maybe it says, yes, we do find such a person in halacha that you them in base. We find the halacha of titanodik, what's called the fluid mud. Yechech will prove this point, where it's liquidy. You're able to pour the mud from one vessel to another because it's very soft. That will prove because shemitzdarf it combines to complete the measurement of larbam sa, a mikvah that's 40 sa. But if you toivel in a mikvah that's like just mud, 40 sa, that's all this liquidy mud, most like tefillah, that would not be a valid tefillah. Where do you find this? As Rashi brings, the Mishnah says in the Mikvahs, there's a halacha that many people say by Beis Avon, and this is one of those Mishnayos. Elo mailin v'lei paislim. These will complete the mikvah, and they don't invalidate the mikvah. It talks about snow and hail and ice and salt. And one of the cases, tit hanorik, liquidy mud. Now, what does malin mean? It means it completes. That's going to work. But independently, you would not be able to make a mikvah out of it. So you see that although the titanotic, the liquidy mud will be mitzdarif, but it will not be able to be itself, which Tais discusses, says, wait a second, what do you see from there, what we're trying to point out? But that's what we're trying to compare and say that, yeah, meaning to say, even though it itself is not valid, but it can be used to complete, say also, the avra will be mitzdarif, but you cannot sleep beneath the avra itself. So now look at the next Mishnah, continue regarding combining the walls to the schach. Here we have it in a different context. Interesting cases, the Mishnah says, let's say someone makes his sukkah like the hut of the hunters, which they trap birds. They make like a kaveris, which is like a beehive, which not exactly like as this picture has it, but similar, where it's actually slanty, so that the walls and the roof are really one continuous entity, like a hut. Oh, or a similar case, let's say you lean it against the wall, you take the reeds, you lean it against the wall, and one end is on the ground. So there's a paisel, let's say it's going to be invalid, because there's no roof. What do you mean there's no roof? It's not recognizable. What's the roof? What's the wall? Because he holds what's called oil meshupa, slanty tent, is not an oil, unless you have at least one tefach that's vertical and then it goes as the Gemara is going to quote in the Brisa, then it'll be a roof. But here, what's the roof? Which is this a wall or is this a roof? Since it's not clearly discernible, it's not going to function as an oil. Chacham say no, it's going to be kosher because they hold shipul laham ka halim dami. As the Gemara qualifies, Tanya will learn the Brisa. Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer agrees on both cases of the Mishnah. On the case of tzrif, of the hut, and of when you lean the thing against the wall, that she'im migbim and karka tefach, if you elevate these reeds from the ground, tefach. Oh, so now it's interesting. If you're going to elevate it a tefach from the ground, you're going to say lavud regarding the vertical. So it's as if there's a tefach of vertical wall over here, and now you recognize the tzrif, this as if it's a roof, because you have a shiur of oil in vertical. So that's going to be valid. Or let's say, and this is specifically going on the case of when you're leaning against the wall, let's say this picture, let's say you're distancing this tzrif, this board from the wall, a tefach. So let's say it was leaning on pegs. So you're going to say lavud horizontally, and you're not going to say it on the slant. So that's going to be the roof. In those cases, shikshit can be kosher because you can clearly discern something distinct, the oil from that thing. So again, either love is going to tell us a roof, and this is going to be the wall, or this is going to tell us oil, and this is going to be the roof. But since it's discernible, then it's going to be kosher. So my time the Rabbah, what's the reason Rabbah in our Mishnah that they say that it is kosher? These cases it's not discernible because they hold a slanty tent is like a tent, even though you didn't elevate it, you didn't distance it, it's still going to be kosher. I think Gemara brings a story that Abaye Ashkechel Rabbi Yosef, Abaye encountered Rabbi Yosef, the Kokoni Bekilas Chasan B'Sukkah. He was sleeping in the bridal canopy in a sukkah because, as we explained this on prior dafim, that since it doesn't have a roof of a tefach, so it's not going to take oil to separate. On that, Rabbi Yosef, Abaye said to Rabbi Yosef, but come on, who are you going like? Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, who he says, yeah, the slanty oil is not an oil. But Shavkis Rabbanim of the Rabbi Eliezer, you're leaving the Rabbanim? What do you mean? According to Rabbanim, this is an oil. What do you mean you don't have an oil of a tefach? That's only if you needed a horizontal oil. According to Rabbanim, you don't need. They hold that even though it's slanted, it's considered as an oil. You're sleeping in a separate oil in the sukkah. Rabbi Yosef said to him, oh, Brisa Epchatani, yeah, but I have a Brisa that teaches the opposite version of our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer is the one that says that it's kosher. Chacham says it's going to be invalid because there's no roof. Oh, that means to say the Chachamim are the ones who say that a slanty roof is not a roof. So in the case of a Mishnah, it's possible, but here it would be kosher because it's not an oil. So that he said Shavkis Masnidim Abdis Kepraisa. Abai tells him what? You're leaving the version of the Mishnah and you're doing like the version of the Brisa? First he asked me, you're leaving the Chachamim going like Rabbi Eliezer, but how can you take a version of a Brisa which is less authoritative than the Mishnah? Amalei says, no Masnidim, our Mishnah's version is Yechidohi. Is only an individual Tana's opinion. It's Reb Nassim, who's an individual Tana, who he said this version of our Mishnah. But the Chacham in the generation of Reb Nassim disagreed, and they said that actually Rabbi Eliezer is the one who says kosher, a slanting oil, and Chacham says invalid. Because the Tana learned the Brisa. If someone makes a sukkah like a hut, or it leans against the wall, Reb Nassim, he says the version of our Mishnah. Eliezer Paisel, he says not valid because there's no roof. It's kosher like our Mishnah, but it's Reb Nassim, the Das Yachid, that's saying like our Mishnah, and therefore obviously the Chacham of his generation disagree with him, and therefore must be the Chacham actually held that Shipul oil is lav kol dami, and therefore it says Rabbi Yosef Tabai, I'm able to sleep in this bridal canopy in the sukkah because it doesn't have oil of a tefach, and the fact that it's slanted, that Chacham hold that a slanted oil is not an oil, and therefore it's not considered sleeping in this bridal canopy and not in the sukkah. If you now look at the next Mishnah, continuing regarding something that's Makabel Tumah, that's invalid to be used as schach. So Machzel is coming, a reed mat, which is very hard and it's not easy to sit on, and that's significant. So if it's Gedola, if it's a very large mat, so it depends. If a Salashchiva, if you made it and you designated for this purposes, that you want it to be used for laying down on, you put it out to you're having a camping trip, and you want something to lay on So you made it into a kli, because it's meant to lay on, like you made it into a mattress. So mekabel is tumah, now it's mekabel tumah. And v'emes achma, obviously you can't use as schach. But let's say you had in mind these mats, you went to the store, went to the depot, and you got these reed mats you can use as schach. Okay, the mesachma, you give it as schach. It's not mekabel tumah because it's not a kli, because generally it's not used for laying, it's very hard to lay on. And the Gemara is going to ask, it seems to be a contradiction of the inferences, because it sounds like only if you had in mind, then if you had in mind for sleeping, then it's mekabel tumah. Let's say you didn't have anything in mind. These contradictory inferences. It sounds like if you had in mind for shchiva, then it's not good. If you had in mind for seichel, then it is good. Once you had nothing in mind, so that seems to be contradicted inferences. But there's a Rabbi Eliezer, and he says, achas ketan achas gedela. The Tanakhama only spoke about a large mat, large reed mat. Rabbi Eliezer mentions both a small one and a large one. Asal shchiva, if you made it for laying, okay, the mekabel is tumah. It's a mattress. It's mekabel tumah. Not v'emes you can't use a schach. But if you made it l'sichel, then you could use this schach as not mekabel tumah. So Gemara is going to explain what exactly is he saying and what is the dispute with the Tanakhama. Meaning, if you specified explicitly that you want it for laying or for a schach, no one's going to disagree if it's large or small. You specified, so it's going to be what you specified. Rather, as the Gemara is going to explain, a small mat is more easily used for laying. A large mat, which is harder, is more easily used as schach. That's going to be a significant thing. But the Gemara first says hagu v'kasha. Seems to be a difficulty according to the Tanakhama. Amrit, first you said, okay, asal shchiva, this large reed mat. You said if you made it and that's what you wanted it for, you made it for laying down. So you said, okay, it's a mattress. Famous you can't use a schach. Yeah, but it sounds like time of asal shchiva. It sounds like because you made it for laying. Hastama, let's say you didn't specify anything, would sound like that the default is l'sichach. It's can be kosher. The problem is the next words in the Mishnah you said v'adatani, then you said l'sichach. Oh, if you made it for schach, okay, mesachim, then you can use it for schach. But it sounds like time of asal l'sichach. It sounds like because you made it for schach. Hastama, but the default would be l'shchiva for laying. So is stam l'sichach or stam l'shchiva? They might say, holy gosh, not difficult. Why not? Kan, the Reish is talking about b'gedayla, a large mat, like the opening words of the Tanakhama. That's when he says that only if you made it for shchiva is going to be a problem. But the stama would be for schach. Kan, the sefer was b'ktana, was by a small mat. So the sefer is not the same as the Reish. The sefer was saying, if it's a small reed mat and you made it for schach, then you can do the schach. Because actually the stama, the default of a small one, is actually made for laying. So it's not a difficulty. It's talking about two different cases. The problem is, says the Gemara, Bishlam Rabban Lakash. Okay, that's right. According to Rabban, you don't have a difficulty because they could just explain. But the Rabbi Eliezer, but you would have a difficulty then the way you're interpreting for Rabbi Eliezer. Because now we learn the Sefer the Mishnah that Rabbi Eliezer, he says, Achas Ketan of Achas Ketan. He says whether it's a small mat or a large reed mat, Asal L'shchiva, if you made it for laying, you can't use schach. But it sounds like time of the asal l'shchiva. The reason is because you made it for laying. Hastama. But in general, both for big and for small, would be l'sicha, would be for schach. But Amos say, if you look at the next words of Rabbi Eliezer, he said, asal l'sicha, if you made it for schach, mesachim ba, then you could use it for schach. But it sounds like time of the asal l'sicha, because you made it for schach. Hastama. But if you didn't say anything, then l'shchiva would be for laying. And then Rashi points out, according to Eliezer, you cannot answer like you answer the Tanakhama, that one's talking about large and one's talking about small. Because Eliezer is saying that they're both talking about large and small. Like he says, achas gedal v'achas ketana. So how are you going to resolve this contradiction of inferences for Rabbi Eliezer? So Elam Rava says, you're right. Don't say like we answered before, that the first case of Tanakhama was talking about a large reed mat and the Sefer was talking about a small one, and both of them are talking about that you explicit what you wanted, because if that would be the case, that would not resolve Rabbi Eliezer as we just asked. Rather, whenever the Mishnah says that you're making it l'sichuch, whether we're talking about the Sefer of the Tanakhama or whether we're talking about Rabbi Eliezer, actually that really means stama. So l'sichuch doesn't mean that you had a mind for schach. It just means you did not have a mind for shchiva. And that's actually, as the Gemara is going to explain, is the wording of the Tanakhama, that when you have by the large one, l'sichuch is going to be kosher, it means stama. Because stama, the large one, is made for sichuch. But the Tanakhama didn't talk about the small one at all. So the Gemara explains. By the large reed mats, no one's going to disagree. The stam l'sich. As Rashi had pointed out right away, the large reed mats are very hard to sleep on. So generally, that would be used as schach, not as a bed. Ki pligi, what's the machlekes Tanakama Eliezer? Is biktana, is by a small reed mat. Tanakama held stam ktan l'shchiva. Yeah, regularly a small reed mat, a person would use for laying. And therefore, unless you specify l'sichuch, it's going to be a problem. And therefore, that's why the Tanakama did not include the case of a ketana, because it's not stam l'sichuch, it's actually stam l'shchiva. From the Yezus, however, he held that even stam ketana, even a regular small one, is not l'sichuch. No, it's still hard to read mat, even though it's small. And it also would be normally used for schach. And as the Gemara continues on the Chaf Manal, now the Gemara is going to explain how this fits into the words of the Mishnah. Tanakama said, Machzelas hakonim, the reed mats, if it's gedayla, if it's large, so asal l'shchiva. Yes, if you explicitly went and you made it for laying down, even though normally it's not, okay, you're making it for a mattress, and Kabbalah Thomas, you can't use a schach. Yes, and that's what we had explained in the Tanakama. It's only time of the asal l'shchiva. It's only because you made it for laying down. But if we could say that it was for schach, and how would that be? Let's say when you didn't specify anything. Oh, hastama, the default. If you didn't specify, the word should be nasa kemisha salasichuch. It's as if you made it for sichuch, and therefore mesachimba, and then you could use it for schach because it's not makabel tama. So as Rashi explains, by the large reed mat, no one disagrees that stamel is lasichuch. Both according to Tanakama and according to Eliezer, that the large one, we're going to say stamel lasichuch. The whole machlekes was by the small reed mat. The Tanakama didn't discuss, he didn't talk about the small reed mat. He didn't mention it because he held that only by the large one did we say stamel lasichuch. But by the small one, actually stam would be l'shchiva, so we'd have a different halacha. And we skipped the parentheses. And then Rabbi Eliezer came to say that no, the small one is like the large one, that achas ketana, v'achas gedela. No, it doesn't make a difference if a small reed mat or a large reed mat. If you explicitly made it for laying down, okay, so you can't use it for schach. But if we could say that it'll be usable for schach, and how would that be? For example, let's say you made it stumble without specifying, and ksheir l'sichuch, it's going to be valid for schach, you could use it for schach, because not makabel tumah, that was machlekes between Eliezer and the Chacham. Thank you for any time for hosting us.